Thanks everyone for coming along tonight. Welcome to our conversation on springs and soaks. We had about 40 odd people register, which is great to see the interest there has been in the topic and the interest in there is in these diverse and overlooked ecosystems. So this event sprung out, and I apologise for that pun, from a larger landscape vision and project, the Greenhill to Black Hill Biolink project. And the Greenhill to Black Hill Biolink is a collaborative endeavour to protect, restore and reconnect the woodlands and river ecosystems between Greenhill and Black Hill just north of Kyneton. It's Dja Wurrung and Toongaroong country. And the objective of that project is to create a healthy and sustainable future for both people and nature in that region. The project emerged after concerned landholders who have over years taken steps to improve and protect nature on their properties, realising that they needed a plan for the landscape, not just their own properties. Because despite their individual efforts, they were still witnessing decline and loss of the native ecosystems in their region. So the starting point for this venture really was the development of the starting point in the development of that plan was the undertaking of surveys of the properties in the region to assess what nature they still supported and what condition it was in and what issues it faced. So Biolinks, working with the landowners, conducted over 20 property surveys and found that despite the region being heavily altered since European arrival, patches of original grasslands, woodlands and wetland ecosystems still exist. And of those ecosystems that are still around, small wetlands, springs and soaks were found on each and every property. So these are ecosystems that were not recorded on any government vegetation database or map. Farmers knew about them, and some had tails of strange hairy land crabs emerging from them at times, or freshwater mussels sometimes being found in them. But more often than not, they were surprised to learn that these pugs that cows got stuck in were actually unique and important ecosystems. They were dependent on groundwater, and they were once a very widespread feature of the ecology and the landscape in this region. So the community determined that springs and soaks should be a priority value for the restoration and reconnection in their Greenhill to Black Hill Biolink. So tonight is about learning more about their secrets, raising their profile and improving our ability to help protect and restore them. So before we really kick off, I realise it was quite remiss to not actually acknowledge the country that we're working on today and speaking on. Just want to, before we fully kick off, acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. The project area, the Greenhill to Black Hill Biolink, is both Toongaroong and Dja Wurrung country. I'd like to pay respects to their elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. We've got two wonderful speakers to take us on this journey of springs and soaks tonight. We've got Paul Foreman, who some of you will know. Paul is an ecologist and botanist working with the Alliance. He's got over 30 years of experience in a range of technical, strategic and management roles across Victoria and Australia. He's worked in state and local government, as well as Trust for Nature, Bush Heritage Australia, and established his own consulting business in 2009. And he's also currently researching the role of Aboriginal burning in grasslands. And we have Damien Cook here with us too. Damien is the Director and Senior Restoration Ecologist at the Wetland Revival Trust. He's a keen naturalist. He's been a keen naturalist for 35 years and recognised expert in wetland, riparian and terrestrial ecology, particularly in the factors affecting the establishment and management of aquatic and wetland plants and the revegetation of terrestrial grassland and woodland ecosystems. We feel very lucky to have had him working with us on these springs and soak systems within the region and to have him here speaking with us this evening. So I'm going to hand over to Paul and Damien.
Paul, you're on mute. Sorry. Thanks, Sophie. I'm going to move across to our presentation. Sasha, you can kick it off if you like. So, yeah, thanks very much for coming along tonight, and I hope you enjoy the presentation. And please chuck some questions in the chat at the end, and we can maybe have a bit more of a dialogue about this. Yeah, let's move to the next one, Sasha. Many people would think about springs as being something that you find in inland Australia, part of the Great Artesian Basin up in the arid zone and inland areas, and maybe even been to some of the more famous springs that are out there, which are extraordinary landscapes that, you know, have these kind of oases in the middle of very dry, parched deserts. And the next one, please. And I had the fortune when I was at Bush Heritage to be involved in the purchase of a property called Edgbaston in central Queensland, and it looks like this. It's in a very dry landscape on the edge of the Mitchell grass downs and the desert uplands. And there's these extraordinary springs that have been there for a very long time geologically, and as a result, they're biologically teeming with endemic species. And you can see a few of them in this shot. The next one, Sasha. I won't dwell on this stuff too long. I'm just trying to give a bit of a context. There's this species, for example, is only found at one spring at Edgbaston, so it's restricted to one spot, about 30 square metres in size. And then there's lots of other things as well. Next one. This next slide, this is a grass that's only just recently been described, and it fringes these wetlands, these springs. It's a really special grass that's quite new to science. And then, of course, there's also wildlife. So the next slide, please. The red-fin blue-eye is probably the famous species associated with these springs. So these areas are teeming with endemic species because of their extraordinary history and ecology. Next slide, please. But it turns out in Victoria, there are actually a lot of springs and soak systems that are sort of similar in some ways, in the sense that they come out of aquifers in the ground, and they have quite complex patterning and diversity in this state and also other parts of Southeast Australia, usually associated with granitic ranges. But right across central Victoria, they're quite widespread, but also very poorly understood. This is just an example of some of the systems that we do know about. Next slide, please. This is an example from Mount Coorong, just not that far, or northwest of Bendigo. There's a series of granitic ranges. Keira is another one, and it turns out that on the base, around the margins of these hills, you get discharge of fresh water, and there are natural wetlands associated with those discharge points. But the special thing about this particular site is that the springs there are intermittent, so they only really flow and do their thing when we have flood conditions every now and again. Next one, please. This is a Mount Keira shot. I was involved with the Friends of Keira and the Wedderburn CMN years ago doing some assessment work, and we ended up getting this particular community listed under the Flora and Fauna Guarantee Act because of its unique features. Next one, please. And then there's another one. This is another example, Mount Beckworth, which is a bit closer again, not the other side of Clunes. Next slide, please. This is Mount Alexander. This is on the base of Mount Alexander on the western side. There's quite a number of sites in this area, again, full of restricted species. Next one, please. And then over at Winton Wetlands, some of you might know Lake McCowan, or ex-Lake McCowan, that's now been drained and being restored back into its original wetland complex. There are a series of springs that discharge in the surrounding granitic hills. Next one, please. So in terms of the flora, just giving you a few examples, there's a range of herbaceous plants, or non-woody things that have shortly lived and flower and grow productively for periods when things are very wet, and then they die back when conditions are not so. And Damien's going to talk about some of these a little bit in a second, just to give you an example of those kinds. And the next slide is, if you just go click the next one, Sasha. There's also woody species associated, so not just the small ephemeral things, but also long-lived, often large things like trees, tea tree, golden spray, and some of these are quite rare and some of them are quite restricted. Next one, please. The general hydrology for these kind of systems ranges, as I mentioned before, with fractured rock above the basement, and they're quite large, and in flood periods, these kind of fractured areas literally fill up with water, as it were, like a giant tank, and then in the following weeks and months and even years, they'll drain out slowly at the break of slope, and then you get these discharges, intermittent or permanent springs in some cases. So that's the general model there. So next one, please. But in the Greenhill to Black Hill area, just north of Kyneton, which is in the south part of this map, you can see it's a unique environment where you have granitic ranges on sort of the northwest and the southeast, and then there's the valley of the Campaspe going through the middle, and then that green area is the basalt lava flows. And you might be able to pick up some small little red patches along some of the minor branches of the Campaspe, and these are some of the areas where we've identified soaks. And as Sophie said before, just about all the properties we've gone on to, in fact, I think everyone had some kind of a wetland soak system on them. Next slide, please. And this is what they look like. You can actually, if you look on Google Earth, you can actually see evidence of these and pick them up. Those green patches in the valleys and the sides of the valleys are often wetland dominated, not just infestations of weeds. And at the right time of the year, you can see them quite clearly. This is just an example just south of Black Hill. And we estimate around about 5% of that area, that study area, would have been occupied by these systems originally. Next one, please. Yeah, so just to give you an example, this is a vegetation map. So there's quite a lot of vegetation types across this area. Mostly they're sort of terrestrial or drier kinds of one kind or another, but there's also some wettish communities, mainly riparian in nature. But it turns out these maps are a little bit inadequate. So if we go to the next slide, I've just overlaid those patches I mentioned before, and Damien's going to mention in a second that quite a number of different types of wetlands typically associated with these ecosystems are probably would have been present here and have been and are still present as in the form of remnants. But in other words, the diversity that was there is not really well reflected in some of these reconstructions of the original state of the landscape. Next slide, please. Just to give you an idea of, just maybe click the next one, Sasha. There's a hydrological difference with the basalt system. The basalt is quite porous, and when the rain falls into it, it drains right through to the base of the basalt flow, which is usually sitting on top of sedimentary rocks, and then it moves laterally across the landscape and discharges in the sides, usually in gorges. And you can see this is a spot near Reedsdale, and the line marks the boundary between the basalt and the sedimentary rocks. And those little spots I've highlighted there are just little small areas of discharge, which can be either permanent or semi-permanent springs. Next one, please. This is just a couple of examples. So this is one of the ones on one of the properties on the Campaspe Gorge. Next one. This is another one. You can see the big tussocks there, these large tussock forming wetland or amphibious type plants, often in the sort of grass family or the monocot family group, often dominate. It gives you an example of, often weeds are invading in these areas, are subject to grazing and often not well understood or recognised or managed. Next one. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this is another one on the Campaspe. This particular tussock is a slightly unusual species, Carex irinx. No, that's the, and we'll move on to the next one. This is another one, a discharge area on the side of the Campaspe. Even though it's very close to the river, it turns out that the flow of water for this comes out of the basalt rather than out of the river. And at this particular spot, there were some nice holes there that looked like they might have been made by some burrowing crays or yabbies, and I don't know enough about those. And I'll handball over to Damien to give us a chat about what he's been finding and seeing from a natural wildlife perspective. Thanks, Damien. You're on mute still, Damien.
Thanks, Paul. So Sasha, can we have the next slide, please? So yeah, I've been out and done a small amount of field work in this area. So looking on some of the private land, and I think part of the reason that these sites are so poorly known is that particularly in these landscapes, they're not really in nature reserves necessarily or places that people can get to easily, particularly people studying vegetation like botanists. It's really, you know, you need to be invited on to places. So they're not well understood unless someone's come in and done some study on particular places. So yeah, we were lucky enough that through the Biolinks network to actually have a look at these sites. It was really just a day to look around and see what we could find. And obviously, you know, you'd need a lot longer time to do a good inventory of what's out there. But this is a classic example of you can see, you know, and this was in sort of early summer. You can see the pasture in the background there started to brown off because the rest of the soil where the springs aren't is starting to dry out, but where the spring is, you can see it's nice and lush and green, and there's a whole complete changeover of species in that sort of soak ecosystem. And interestingly, like, you know, when you think most people think of wetlands as being you know, flat kind of depressions or basins in the landscape, and the interesting thing about soaks and springs is that they're actually they're wetlands on a slope. So yeah, rather than the wetland plants sort of standing in static water, they're often on sloping ground, and they can sometimes have a pool of water, a standing pool of water at the break of slope. But yeah, often they're just actually water seeping out and seeping down a slope. So yeah, so this is one of the sort of, and there's potentially, depending on the amount of discharge of water and how reliable it is in terms of, you know, how whether it's, you know, pouring out all through summer, or whether it sort of might depend. I suppose it's depending on the groundwater size of the groundwater catchment and the porosity of the rock and a whole bunch of other factors that so each spring will have its own characteristics in terms of how much water it will produce, and therefore that will determine what species of plants, you know, anything from species like here, this is swamp wallaby grass, and some types of juncus or types of rush, which are quite tolerant of drying. So this little spring, yeah, might sort of flow for sort of 3 or 4 months of the year, and then potentially dry out. Whereas other sites, the vegetation might be reliant on being wet for 9 or 12 months of the year. So so each spring will have kind of a unique vegetation type, depending on its sort of unique hydrology. Next slide. So some of the sorts of animals that will use spring soak kind of wetlands are things that that forage in wetland environments. So this is a Latham snipe, which actually breeds in Japan. So you'll never find a Latham snipe nest in Australia. So they breed on Hokkaido, on the island, northern island of Japan, and so they're up there now in our winter. So it's the summer up there in Hokkaido, or sort of late spring heading into summer now. So they'll be nesting up there at the moment. But then Hokkaido has a very sort of harsh winter, and so as soon as their summer breeding season finishes there, it's coming into our spring, and usually around about August, September, we start to see snipe in this species of snipe in Australia. And that long beak.
Damien, I have seen them on below the house.
Oh yeah, yep.
Yeah, well, occasionally. They're very hard to detect because they're so speedy. Correct?
They're very speedy, yes, and they're kind of really well camouflaged as well. So they're stripy, and they've got that broken,
stick to the rushes and things like that.
Yeah, they really like kind of tall, what people sort of tall rank grassland, or, you know, sort of vegetation, and they'll often just sort of explode from your feet. So they're one of those things you can absolutely get a bit of a fright, right, because you'll be walking along through the road.
I have seen them down the river recently.
Yeah. Okay. Well, they should have headed off by now. If there's any laggards hanging around there now, they must have missed the boat to fly to Japan, because they'll be missing out on the breeding season. But so they like these sort of, and that long beak is used for probing into soft soils or soft sediments and the mud of the springs and soaks, reaching down to pluck out worms and things. So the soaks will have a unique invertebrate fauna. So things like land yabbies or angaeus crayfish. They're a particular group of crayfish that aren't necessarily associated with water bodies, but they burrow into the ground, and they need water. They take their oxygen from water, so they don't breathe air as such. So they burrow down to the water table, and they can basically survive in these areas by digging down to where the water is. So we'll go to the So anyway, there's a whole unique fauna associated with these springs, invertebrates and vertebrates. So this is a plains froglet, and these guys obviously need water for their tadpoles to live in. So for these sort of frogs to survive around the springs, they would need some sort of pool of water for the tadpoles. But certainly things like brown tree frogs and a range of other frog species will be able to use these springs and soaks, and they act as refugia. So in dry times when other environments might run dry, particularly larger soaks with a large groundwater catchment, potentially keep flowing into dry periods and provide refuges in the landscape for things like frogs. Next picture. So there's a range of reptiles that will live around these kind of environments as well. So this is a 3-line skink, and it's what we call a Bassian species. So Australia is divided up into these faunal regions, and so the Aryan region is the deserts and sort of inland Australia. The Bassian region sort of coming down into southern Victoria, Tasmania, either side of Bass Strait, obviously, and so it's a real usually south of the divide kind of a species, but it does occur further north, sort of up along the lower Campaspe and even up around Lianganuk, but really in sort of wet mesic environments. So it's sort of at the upper limit of its range. It's about as warm and dry as it gets is kind of in this area, and so it's a species that likes tussocky kind of moist environments that would live around the springs. And the next picture is another skink. This guy here is a beautiful tussock skink, listed as endangered in Victoria. This is the volcanic plains form of the tussock skink that's also got a form that lives in the Alps as well. And it's a male with that really bright red stripe. It's in breeding condition. This species is often found around wetlands and springs and soaks on volcanics as well. Next picture. So so there's a range of fauna species and also flora species, which are quite restricted. So this is an interesting type of rush, or threadrush, or Juncus filocaulus. Its distribution is mostly in alpine regions of Victoria, so it's usually in sort of high montane kind of wet environments, but it also appears in some lowland environments. So for example, it was at a couple of the sites we looked at along the Campaspe, and yeah, it's just so it's quite a disjunct distribution. So next picture. So one of the things about the springs we looked at, the springs and soaks, is that they've had a history of being grazed, and I think and often actually also disturbed, because people have noticed that they're a source of water. There's water kind of leaking out of the side of a hill or whatever. So quite often people have modified them by digging a hole, digging a dam, so they can catch the water, so stock can drink there. And so people can make use of it. So yeah, we've got modification from humans, digging holes and things. We've got modifications because of stock coming and pugging, and also stock like sheep and cattle coming and eating palatable species. So there's probably a whole range of more sensitive species that have potentially been knocked out of the landscape. So something like this little fairy's apron, is Utricularia buglholii. It's a little carnivorous plant, and it's reasonably sensitive to pugging and soil disturbance. If there's lots of hard little hooves, like sheep hooves and things like that, tromping through around its habitat, will just get sort of pummeled into the ground. So, although having said that, there are areas which are maybe lightly grazed or haven't had as heavy grazing pressure where these Faeries apron can survive. So, so the next picture is actually not far from the study area we're looking at, but this is a bit of a soak, actually off the granitic bald hill area. So it's yeah, and it's just an absolute carpet of Faeries aprons, and that photo was taken in spring of 2020, and yeah, and that's on a private block that's grazed by sheep, but obviously grazed quite lightly, and so yeah, I suppose there's opportunities we could possibly reintroduce some of these species into the Campaspe springs and soaks, but to do so, I think we'd need to potentially control grazing pressure would be a definite factor. So, and some I have been involved in some restoration of spring soak kind of vegetation, not in this region, but in Gippsland where we fenced off springs. And also I've done some study of some of the springs in the Strathbogie ranges where they were also fenced off from stock, to sort of stop that physical disturbance of the pugging and the selective grazing. They respond in different ways. Some of the springs, like I think by fencing them out, you can they sometimes respond and species regenerate quite well. So some of those ones in the Strathbogies, there was a lot of pipeworts and Faeries aprons and things sort of came back quite well. The problem sometimes though is if you do fence something out, the stock might be, as well as eating the native vegetation, they might be eating down weeds as well. So it's not just as simple as fencing something out. Sometimes you actually have to implement a weed control strategy as well, because the weeds might grow quite prolifically if you exclude stock altogether. So yeah, so I suppose some of the strategies for restoring springs and soaks would be to do grazing management, weed control, and potentially sort of reintroduction of species that might have been lost from the landscape. Next slide. So for example, all the springs I looked at, there were a range of vegetation types, ranging from sort of grassy wetlands to some of the more sedge-dominated things that Paul showed the picture of the Carrack sinks. There's sort of a wet verge sedge land type of ecosystem. There's one of the springs had a little pool associated with it, which had a sort of an aquatic herbland of things like water ribbons and mud dock and other sort of more aquatic type species. But one of the things that was missing from the soaks we looked at was woody sort of vegetation. This is woolly tea tree, and this is a soak down in southwestern Victoria on a volcanic area, and it's pretty much dominated by the beautiful grey coloured woolly tea tree, and obviously that's quite a different habitat to the sort of grassy and sedgy kind of wetlands, and it'll have a whole completely different suite of species associated with that dense shrubby vegetation. So things like little birds like grey fantails and ringtail possums would build drays in the tea tree, and the tea trees flower and produce nectar, and so they're providing a range of different sort of habitat attributes. And these sort of scrubby kind of swamp scrub kind of ecosystems were potentially, well, they were definitely much more widespread, and particularly on the volcanic plains, and they were mapped even by some of the early surveyors mapped these sort of patches of scrub around spring and soak areas, but yeah, they were pretty comprehensively wiped out of some places. So it's a habitat that's kind of been pretty much destroyed in some areas. So even up at the Upper Merry Creek, we know that there were springs and soaks, and they were quite well documented and described, that were vegetated by this woolly tea tree. And these woolly tea tree scrubs have as I said, they're a unique environment. And there are even, like, there's a little threatened orchid. If we go to the next slide, there's a little tiny greenhood that pretty much only grows in these Pterostylis tenuissima, that only grows in these woolly tea tree dominated scrubs on basalt soils associated with a groundwater discharge. So yeah, so there can be these quite unique species associated with these wetlands. And I think that's my last slide. Is that the last one, Sasha?
Yes, these ones are back for you, Paul.
Yeah, so thanks, Damien. That's awesome. But there's some of them very insightful participants has already sent in some questions, and I thought this would be a good start, I suppose, for a Q&A session towards the end. But maybe between Damien and I, we could just have a quick sort of response to some of these. You're up for that, Damien?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So do we have a baseline for the, you know, from the past, I suppose? I think we do collectively across much of the state, but we don't necessarily for particular areas. Would you say, Damien? Or what would your perspective on that one?
Yeah, look, I think some areas probably better documented than others in terms of, you know, some of that sort of mapping that was those early survey maps. In terms of species inventory, like unless there was, you know, a naturalist with a particular interest, like the Mary Creek Valley is lucky that there was I think he was a reverend or some other kind of religious-y type character who was also into plants, documented you know, species lists for, you know, quite early on for that area, and documented some of the kind of vegetation. But so yeah, I suppose there's rare examples where they're probably quite good species lists, but I'm not aware of. And I did a search of the current sort of databases for the area around sort of the Snipes Creek and the Soaks area that I looked at, and there's not a great deal of current sort of data, you know, information in the government databases on sort of spring soak kind of species in that area. So unless someone's got the secret diary of a naturalist who was in that area, you know, 50 or 100 years ago, you know, we probably lost. You know, it's probably, we'd have to kind of surmise the kind of the species, you know, some of the species that potentially were in that area.
Yeah, so we sort of have a rough idea, but you know, a lot of the details are missing. And I guess the more information we can dig up, either in the form of the historic records, but also, you know, novel sites that no one's been to before, that are tucked out the back of someone's property that happen to have escaped most of the modification in the last 150 years, you know, then we might be able to sort of add value and get a better picture for particular parts of the state. I'm not aware.
Yeah.
From my travels in this area, Damien, you know, I haven't seen any areas that I'd regard as being sort of unmodified. I've certainly seen areas that are in better condition than others, but as for unmodified, I don't reckon I've seen any in this particular area, but they might be further afield.
Yeah, look, I'd agree. Sorry, go on, Huntley.
The difference about this area here, as I understand it, is that when this was surveyed back in the 1850s, it was surveyed to keep people from leaving the goldfields. A lot of people, when the goldfields started, a lot of people did their backsides, and they started going back from whence they came, right? So to entice people to stay, they surveyed this area very early into very small holdings. I mean, there are surveyed areas here on farm, you know, like just near us, who have got 20 or 30 titles on a 300 or 400 acre parcel of land, right? They have had no significance at all up until the 70s, when urban sprawl began, and so there's probably no areas that haven't been trampled on, that's the point I'm making here, because it was on a volcanic plain. They exploited that. The surveyors exploited those areas very early on the piece, and they were taken up very quickly. It was a subsistence type farming system up until the 1890s depression. And then that just wiped out the subsistence farmers. And then, you know, like probably around here, Kim would clarify this more than me, but you'd be looking at holdings of, you know, by the 70s were in the 300 to 400 acres vicinity, where when you went into the granite type country, you get into much larger holdings and you get more, you get better, less damage, for want of a better word, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, there's been less intense use of the land, and therefore potentially greater biodiversity survive because it hasn't been as severely impacted by heavy stocking rates and things like that. And I think that that pretty sums it up pretty nicely, Huntley. That these fertile, particularly well watered kind of environments, we know where there was water, where there was higher rainfall, that they've been. It's very hard to find anything sort of pristine as such. It's just but particularly with weed invasion and soil disturbances and even just minor earthworks, like digging out of a dam or something like that, could have a massive impact on the vegetation in a soak and the downstream consequences as well, because as soon as you put a dam or something there, you're robbing the water from the downstream catchment. So there's severe impacts, and it's I think what Paul was saying, there's potentially are little things tucked away on private property that we don't know about that would be incredibly exciting to find. If you might find a whole bunch of things like threatened species, and the thing about wetlands and particularly wetland invertebrates, like some of those land yabby things, they're still being described. If you want to name something after yourself, it's a great being an invertebrate expert's a great way to find new species, because and even wetland plants, the taxonomy of wetland plants is still being resolved. There's new species kind of being described all the time. Again, if you're interested in finding new species, getting into wetland plant taxonomy is a fertile field, because there's a lot of terrestrial vegetation has kind of been worked out, and but wetlands, because they're squishy and they're muddy and leachy and mosquito-y, you've got to be a certain type of botanist to wants to hang around in those kind of environments sometimes. And there's a whole bunch of things that are undescribed, and so so they're quite fertile areas for ecological research.
I was going to, just in response to that last question, I think we sort of touched on the common species and the rare ones, which are often the ones that sort of can't survive the disturbances that we've talked about. So I guess the common species are the ones that can cope with that by and large, and the rare ones are the ones that don't. But in terms of reintroductions, like as Damien said before, some simple measures like controlling stock, even just having rotational grazing instead of set stocking, can actually benefit some sites, and some of these species will respond positively to that sort of intervention. But in other cases, some other things might be needed, like a little bit of targeted weed control, and even some replanting and reintroduction of species that have been knocked out, like the woolly tea tree, and maybe even stuff like golden spray, or some of the big tussocks like poa and so on, could well add value to improving the health of these sites. So just a bit of thought gone into what's possible and what's likely to be most successful at an individual site will potentially go a long way. Sasha, I thought there's a lot of other questions coming through, so maybe we should start going through those and just maybe get some people to speak to that, or I guess we've only got limited time.
Yeah, absolutely. So Kylie asked the question, are you looking for more springs and soaks to study in Central Victoria? I assume the answer is yes.
We certainly are, and as I said, the documentation, the records we've got are pretty scant and pretty sort of rough and ready, and we need to do a lot more work in this space. And I'd love to see more systematic and resourced survey and assessment and getting out on private land, because that's where most of them, or many of them, are. knocking on people's doors and seeing what we can discover. I did a little bit of that a couple of years ago over near Beckworth, Mount Beckworth near Clunes, and I was surprised to find there's one particular spot that I found on some private property, a sort of 40-acre lot that was right up the back near the edge of the breaker's slope on the range, and it was just full of these small herbaceous wildflowers, including fairy aprons and even the woody stuff as well, and some ferns and lots of other stuff that you normally wouldn't expect in those environments. And there it was on this property. So I think there's more of those out there, and I'd love to do something systematic to try and get them on the radar and see more protection before they disappear completely.
Yep. So Tanya asks, the woody vegetation that's missing from local soaks, what species do you think they are?
Do you want to have a go at that one, Damien?
Yeah, I can have a try. Yeah, so I think woolly tea tree is probably a candidate that would be pretty high up there. Other sorts of tea tree, like prickly tea tree, would be another one that's that was potentially around. It sort of depends on the soak in terms of the sort of the reliability of it. Some soaks might have had things like swamp gums and so probably not a huge range of species. Golden spray, I think Paul also mentioned, Viminaria jansia, and there's a sort of a range of potential other things like some there's a few pultoneas and peas and things like that that would have potentially been could have occurred in these habitats as well.
Thanks,
Is
Damien.
anything else you can think of, Paul?
I was just thinking of I suppose wetland species like maybe some blackwoods could sort of cope with the margins of them, I suppose, and they'd add a bit of structure and complexity to those areas. It would be good habitat for a lot of critters, that sort of thing.
Yeah. Tree everlastings is another, like Ozothamnus. There's a couple of different Ozothamnus species that will grow around, in quite wet environments. So they're potentially another thing as well.
Okay. Craig asks, if drainage channels have been dug historically, do you recommend filling them in?
You got one, Damien.
So, all right. Well, look, I think before you change anything, it's good to actually, it's hard to sort of just say in a blanket, yep, definitely go and fill it in. I mean, generally I would probably say, if the hydrology's been altered and it's changed the way the environment to the extent that it's possibly changed the vegetation, but I'd always qualify that by saying, well, would be good to actually look at a site, and because sometimes if you've changed the status quo, a new type of things might have rearranged themselves to then suit that habitat, and you could potentially have something rare or interesting growing in a modified environment. Potentially it's worth getting a survey done, having a look at it, and I think that's sort of sometimes we rush in, we think and this has happened numerous times with grasslands where people have gone, we found this native grassland, we've got to fence it off and pull the stock out of it, and then a whole lot of weeds grow, and you lose the thing you were trying to protect. So it's good to sort of investigate the site on its own merits and look at before rushing in and changing something. But I think as a general rule, you could say if the hydrology's been altered, then it's probably going to be good to fill in things like drainage channels and dams or things like that. But as I say, it's probably worth investigating first.
Craig just asked, can we do a site visit for the purposes of checking this if it's between Greenhill and Black Hill? Again, I would assume yes. Craig, if you want to send us your contact information, Craig, we can get in touch.
Yeah, I agree with Damien. It's very much case by case, and it's hard to generalise. But as a general rule, if the hydrology has been modified there could well be scope to restore it, which could mean all sorts of different things. But in the case of these soaks, like Damien said before, they're often discharging wetlands sort of on a slope. They're not a flat sort of basin that collects water like a pond or a wetland out on the flat plains. And so the water's constantly sort of emanating from the rocks and then flowing out downstream, or downslope I should say, to another drainage system. And so that process, that natural discharge process, is continuing today. And I guess my argument would be that as a result of that, it's still got a kind of natural hydrology. And I guess if we play our cards right, we may well be able to restore them, to some degree, just because that natural hydrological cycle is still more or less in place. In some cases, dams being dug into them or drains being used, it could be useful to plug them up if they're no longer useful. But once again, does require a case-by-case assessment. But as a general rule, I like to hedge my bets and go for the least intervention that you can get away with to get a good result and for less cost.
Okay, cool. Hope that answered your question, Craig. Yeah, feel free to get in contact with us. I think Cara might be sending you a message at the moment as well. Vanda asked, hi Vanda, by the way, how high up Granite Hill could you potentially find a soak or spring? Are they mostly down low to the slope?
Do you want to have a go at that, Damien? I've got some thoughts, but if you want to go first.
Sure. Well, look, it's yeah. Look, I think you've nailed it there. That they are, I suppose, further down slope you go, the more like the larger kind of catchment you're going to have, and therefore, the more likely that you're going to have a spring or a soak further down. It's not to say though that you couldn't have a soak quite high up a hill, because as long as there's a bit of a catchment and then an impervious layer where the water soaks down through the rock and then hits a break of slope or a massive slab of rock which stops the water seeping down, and that's not sort of fractured. The water could potentially outcrop sort of quite high up a slope. So probably not likely right at the top of a hill or a mountain, but because you need some sort of catchment, but they could be a fair way up the slope.
Awesome. Okay, well, that's all the questions that I have in the chat. So we might want to move on to the summary points and wrap up.
Yeah.
Someone did ask about the size of the frogs. I could just quickly answer that. So I think
I must have missed that.
Yeah, right at the top. Wanda asked about how big the frogs are, and so the frog I showed was a little tiny plains froglet. So you're looking at about 2 centimeters long for an adult frog. So they're called froglets because they're little frogs. Other sort of types of frogs you get around springs and soaks would depend on so like I said, I mentioned tree frogs, like the little brown tree frog. They're more in the sort of 4 to 5 centimeter kind of range. They're a bit bigger. To have any of the really bigger frogs, like things like growling grass frogs, you would need a soak that was associated with a pool. And like the pool might not necessarily need to be that big, because something like a growling grass frog usually needs water to be there for at least sort of 6 months, 3 to 6 months, because they've got a long tadpole stage, because they're such a big frog, like in the order of sort of 10 centimeters long or so. And that would usually require a fairly deep pool in a creek, or if it was a plains wetland. But a soak or a spring could potentially be much smaller and shallower, but because it's being topped up all the time because of the outflow of the spring, potentially growling grass frogs and some of those other sort of frogs like banjo frogs, or that need a longer time period for their tadpoles to turn into a frog, could use quite small pools, because the spring would be sort of keep them getting topped up.
There are historic records of growling grass frogs in the area. I don't know how long they date back and exactly where they're from, but it was quite a widespread species. Is now much reduced. But I'd be wondering, Damien, do you think there'd be potential through a restoration program to maybe reintroduce that sort of a species into this sort of a landscape in due course?
Yeah, look, it's definitely possible. it's interesting. I mean, the chemistry of the springs and soaks will be interesting to study too, because quite often the water quality or the water chemistry in springs and soaks is can be quite interesting, because it's been seeping through mineral rocks and potentially dissolving, and so it's the mineral and sort of salt and iron content of the water could be interesting. And one of the things that actually benefits growling grass frogs is sometimes they do quite well in mineral rich and salt rich waters, because there's a disease called chytrid fungus, which is a really nasty fungal disease that was introduced into Australia and has decimated some species of frogs. But salts and other sort of dissolved things in water can actually have an antifungal effect, and so growling grass frogs often do well in groundwater discharge areas, because the water can be slightly brackish, and it helps them kind of helps control the fungus on their skin. So so if you had a spring that was a little bit salty or had other sort of dissolved minerals in it, it could potentially be a good site for a refuge site for growling grass frogs to escape from chytrid fungus.
We've had a few more questions come in, so I'm going to try and answer them now. Well, I'm not going to answer them. This one might be for you, Sophie. Kylie asks, are there funding opportunities or incentives to fence and protect these unique ecosystems? Do you know of any?
I don't for this region, and we are looking for them. We're certainly keen to raise their profile and support landholders to protect them in the best way that we determine they should be protected. But yeah, funding has been scarce for these systems. It doesn't. It's not to say that with raising their profile and developing the projects that we're developing, we won't be able to. We will be able to secure some funding in the future. But look, I think you make a great point. It would be great to see the focus shift from just the major waterways to protecting these type of important wetland systems in this region too. So yeah, sorry, I think there are there's more support in some regions, and Damien would certainly be able to comment on that. But in this Kyneton region, we have made some efforts to secure funding to develop this project further, but yeah, there hasn't been a lot of government sort of awareness or funding programs dedicated to this area and these systems to this point. But yeah, we're certainly keen to change that.
Okay, and I'm gonna. Oh, sorry, you go, Damien.
So I was just going to mention, there is some good resources online. So there's a thing called Visualising Victoria's Groundwater, which is a great resource. You can sort of see where discharge areas are, and there was also a bit of a study done on groundwater dependent ecosystems, but by the state government and in conjunction with some of the water authorities like Melbourne Water. So yeah, there's been a little bit of interest in it from a sort of government point of view, but yeah, that hasn't really been followed on with funding and resourcing. And I think yeah, it'd be great, I think, to see something happening on private land where most wetlands that are left in Victoria are on private land. It's really the conservation estate. Wetlands are really underrepresented, and basically, if we want to protect and restore biodiversity of wetlands, we really need private landholders on board. And conservation needs to be sort of tenure blind, because if we don't have private landholders participating, we're going to lose a whole bunch of species.
Cara asks, have you seen growling grass frogs in this region? And Louise asks about small turtles in the soaks. Are they ever present? Is that correct?
So yeah, I can give it a go. So growling grass frogs, I personally haven't heard any growling grass frogs in that particular area. They're not far away. There's certainly fairly recent records. So, but yeah, I personally haven't seen them in that area. The turtles is an interesting question. long-necked turtles were probably indigenous to this area. The turtles are interesting that they've been moved around a fair bit because people have kept them as pets and things. So there's lots of parts of southern Victoria where turtles probably never naturally existed, but now there's populations of basically all three Victorian turtles: Murray River turtles, long-necked turtles, and the broad-shelled river turtle in right across Victoria now. Whereas particularly those first two species, the Murray River turtle and the broad-shelled river turtle, were definitely restricted to north of the Great Divide prior to European invasion. So possibly, the long-necked turtles were around, and little hatchling turtles would potentially, be found in a soak. But yeah, I suppose that they'd be the only small turtles would be the hatchlings of a long-necked turtle, I imagine.
All right, thank you, Damien. So I think we'll wrap up the questions there. We might just go to the very last slide for some summary points.
Yeah, there's a few dot points there. I'm probably running out of time, so I should just go through them. I guess if it's in the recording, people could go back and look at them. But so look, they're a pretty special environment. They're still out there. There's still scope for us to discover them and explore and find what they've got, and to improve them and to protect them. But it's just going to take a lot of effort and focus to do it. And I guess that's part of our intent here, to raise the profile and try and get the community coalescing around this sort of a project, and hopefully we can get together what we need to do it.
Great.
Yeah.
I'll pass back to you, Sophie, for closing statement.
Thanks very much, Paul and Damien, and to everyone who attended and asked the great questions. Really stimulating discussion. It certainly whet my appetite. It's even more wet than it already was. All these watery puns here. Love working with these little spring soaks in this region. It's fabulous. There is one, as we said, on every property in this Biolink. This seminar has given me a real sense that there are some simple things we can do to turn the situation around for them, and that's really hopeful. And we've certainly got strong collaboration in this project. So, just looking after one on their own isn't going to do much, but these ecosystems need to be connected, and through collaboration, we feel that that's something we can achieve too in this project. So really exciting project to be working on. Thank you all for coming. Great to have you. Great discussion. As we said, it'll be available for you to revisit on our website, on our Knowledge Hub. A few other thank yous other than our tremendous presenters. I want to thank Cara Finlay, who is the project coordinator for the Greenhill to Black Hill Biolink, and brought together everybody today. Thank you very much, Cara. Thank you, Sasha, for hosting it so well. And thank you also to the Macedon Ranges Shire Council, who provided a land care grant to focus on the spring soaks and put today's event on. So thanks very much, everybody. Great to have you all here, and please go and enjoy your dinners. Thanks for joining us. See you all.